So let's jump right into things and talk a little bit about what's going on. What has happened recently is Microsoft has set and committed to some retirement dates for certain products. Those products that are expiring next are Windows XP, Office 2003, and Internet Explorer 6. What this means is they will no longer offer their extended support phase. And what that really means to you as a Microsoft customer is you won't get security update bulletins for those products anymore. Obviously, with today's threat landscape and the challenges that you face in the enterprise with managing software, not having security updates from the vendor is going to have a pretty big impact to your business. And what happens is your risk profile goes way up. And so once we get to that drop dead date or that end of life date, you will not receive security updates, and obviously that's something that we want to plan ahead for and establish a migration plan and a process to execute on. Some things you want to be aware of is Microsoft actually publishes support lifecycle policies for the various products. You can see I've included a link here for the Windows fact sheet, which gives you a nice grid and shows you release dates, when the mainstream support phase runs, when the extended support phase runs, and when you're going to end both of those phases. And then something else I want you to keep in mind as we talk through today's topic is the average enterprise deployment takes around 1.5 years to up to 3 years to execute from presenting your initial business case to actually completing the full deployment and validating that process and making sure that you're compliant with your internal goals and policies. So again, keep that in mind, 18 to 32 months, so think of it in terms of 1.5 to 3 years as we talk about some of the challenges with implementing a migration project. What you need to know right now, obviously around XP, is that extended support ends on April 4th of 2014. So you have around 14.5 months at this point. So if you keep in mind our original figure, you're probably, if you don't have Windows XP migration plans, you're already in danger of exponentially increasing your risk profile because it's probably going to take you a minimum of 18 months to execute on even the simplest of migration plans. Windows Vista is still available under extended support, so if you were one of the organizations that deployed Windows Vista, you have a little bit longer, but again, if you look at that, that's going to end in 2017. So in terms of years in the enterprise, your various refresh cycles, that's not a lot of time either. So next, Windows 7 is still available under mainstream support, but you'll notice that mainstream support actually ends in 2015. So in a little less than 2 years from now, Windows 7 is going to be out of mainstream support and go into extended, which is a little bit longer until 2020. And then finally, Windows 8 is out right now, and it's available under mainstream support. But as you can see, that end-of-life date has been set for 2023. So I know that 10 years seems like a long time, but in the terms of enterprise deployment cycles, hardware refresh cycles, and your organizational and budget planning, that's not really that long of a time period. So now that we have that information, let's move on a little bit here. And let's talk a little bit about migration paths. So as you know, Windows XP, we have several releases of service pack levels in different architectures, and that has carried on through Windows Vista 7 and 8. I think what you'll notice on this slide is that things have become slightly more simplified. Part of that is because we don't have as many service packs for later operating systems. But the overall trend has been toward a 64-bit architecture for operating systems. We didn't get there fully with Windows 8. There was some talk during the development of the Windows 8 operating system that it possibly may come out only in a 64-bit flavor, like we saw with 2008 R2. But that did not happen. There's still a tremendous amount of consumer demand for a 32-bit operating system. And of course, all the peripheral hardware and drivers that would require architecture-specific builds. So there's still some movement in the marketplace for that. We don't know exactly what will happen after Windows 8. Many folks have some good ideas. But in general, the idea here is that you should be seeing a shift from 32-bit to 64-bit operating system, and of course to multi-threaded applications that run in that architecture, especially where you have an endpoint application that utilizes a large amount of RAM. In that case, you would want to have a 64-bit architecture. So thinking about that, basically you can go from any Windows release to any other Windows release on a migration scenario. There will be some caveats to that. Specifically, if you're going from a 32-bit operating system to a 64-bit operating system, you'll want to be aware of which drivers are utilized in your environment, especially around printers, peripheral hardware for imaging like scanners or Elmo devices if you have those environment, or even projectors in some cases. A 32-bit driver will not always run on a 64-bit operating system. If you have currently deployed 64-bit operating systems and you want to migrate to 32-bit for some reason, none of your drivers that are currently deployed in that environment will work. We can't back port from 64 to 32-bit in any case, but that's a challenge that can be handled in the migration planning process, which we're going to talk about here in a few minutes. So just to kind of recap, the takeaway from this slide is we understand which architectures are supported by which release, which service packs are available. Those of you that are on SP3 are probably only running an x86 architecture. If you're looking to move to Windows 7 or Windows 8, our advice would be to try and standardize on one or the other architecture. That will simplify greatly your migration process, but that's not always possible. So we'll talk a little bit more about Office here on the next slide. But one thing I do want to point out is when you look at your separate processes for, let's say, a build of Windows 8 in 64-bit and a build of Windows 8 in 32-bit, application suites like Microsoft Office also would need to be deployed in architecture-specific builds. So you're talking about going from maybe having one OS build and one Office customization build to now having two of each, so you have 4 concurrent processes that need to be developed and managed and have to go through regression testing and bug testing and deployment testing and all of those things. So something to keep in mind as you start to decide how you want to deploy a new operating system or migrate from one to the other. Try to be economical and simplify your approach. In many environments, we may see a global or an enterprise-wide rollout of only 64-bit. And then an exception handling process and change management where an end user or a department or an application may require a 32-bit build. That may be deployed to the endpoint. We may do something like in Windows 7 with the XP virtualization mode, or with Windows 8, because that includes a Hyper-V mode on the endpoint. We might be able to virtualize an x86 operating system there for you, whether that's XP or Windows 7 or something else. So moving on, I wanted to talk a little bit about migrating Office. This is a fairly simple diagram, and the point I'm trying to make here is the farther back you are in Office releases, the more of an end user shock you're going to get the farther you travel to the right. Meaning the delta between Office 2000 or XP and Office 2013 is significant, and it's much more significant than, let's say, if you were going from Office 2007 to 2010. The really important thing that happened is around Office 2007, we had the XML-based Office format come out. So that really required a significant sea change in each organization, and that you had to plan for backwards compatibility with Office releases that didn't support the XML format. You had to figure out how to transition users and their document processes from one to the other. And then enable older installs. Maybe you didn't have licenses to upgrade some. There was a tool published by Microsoft to enable the opening and saving of XML-based formats, but that always didn't work as well as we wanted either. So the takeaways from here is we need to understand that the farther you travel in version delta, the more impact that's going to be to your end user, and that's going to increase your requirements for budgeting and knowledge transfer and end user training, and resources that you would need to throw at your migration process. And then there's a few what I'll call speed bumps in the road here that you need to be aware of, let's say around Office 2007 with the introduction of the XML format, and then particularly Office 2013 now with the changes to the UI and the UX in Office 2013. That can be quite a shock for some users. So just as we're getting them used to the ribbon in Office 2007 and 2010, and sort of that native UI, Microsoft has really shifted us into the new UI format which is a lot less, I would say, discernible. Different components in the Office applications, it can be difficult for some users, especially those of us with a little bit older eyes. It's hard for us to find clickable items or actionable items in the window. So those are things that you need to account for as you start to talk about this migration process. And then finally, the later version you can go to, obviously you're buying yourself more time to avoid end-of-life announcements, but there's also quite a bit more excitement around those. And so there are a lot of caveats with the choice that you'll make. You know, there are pluses and minuses to every decision, but in general, we want to try and aim for the latest release that we can support, account for any exceptions that are going to occur, understand what the end-user impact is going to be, and make sure that we build all those into our migration process assumptions so that they can be accounted for as we move forward. So let's talk a little bit about what you should do right now. We put a poll up at the beginning of this webcast to ask you about what operating systems you were deploying. And there was a significant portion of the audience that was still running Windows XP. I don't want to use the term "you're too late" if you're still running Windows XP, but you definitely are in crunch time right now. You essentially have around 14.5 months to transition your environment entirely off of Windows XP if you want to close that gap in the risk profile, right? Again, I'll remind you, when we lose extended support on the operating system in the Office Suite and Internet Explorer 6, we will not receive security update bulletins from whatever your patch management solution may be. And again, that increases the risk profile. It goes way up. So we're kind of behind the gun right now. What are you going to do right now if you're in that situation? Well, the first thing you need to do is inventory, right? Whatever your tool may be, we need to gather inventory. We need to take that collected inventory and put it into a consumable format in reporting. And then we need to evaluate what our situation is, right? What's our risk profile? What's our migration assessment? What are budgetary constraints? What is the organizational goal? Do we have a pending acquisition on the horizon? Maybe your company is going to acquire another company that only has Windows NT everywhere. These are all the questions that you need to consider around what I think is the main question, which is, what do I have? Where is it? What version is it at? And what tools do I have to manage that? The answers to those questions are going to help you form a business plan, right? So your business plan or your business case is what you're going to document and build in order to execute on your migration. That really needs to account for three kind of core things in most enterprises: tools, applications, and the operating system. In this case, I've kind of listed it as IE, Office, and Windows, and that's simplified, but I think it makes the point in that we may have enterprise applications or in-house software that requires a certain version of IE. We may have deployed a certain release of Microsoft Office organization-wide, and there are a lot of little things that go along with that. And then we may have certain business requirements or SLAs or other things in the organization that are going to affect how and where we can deploy software and what can be done. The other things that you need to talk about are, where does virtualization fit in? And the first level of that obviously is application virtualization. Some of you may have a VDI project that's in process in some phase, or you may be looking at it. But again, these are all things you need to consider. And there are a lot of different endpoint management tools that have complementary virtualization suites that can help you accelerate a migration by eliminating the requirement to port or migrate applications and their states from user to user, or from one user's operating system to their new operating system, by taking that software and let's virtualize it, let's deliver it, let's track its compliance and its licensing. And generally, your leading endpoint management suites have some level of integration for those. And then finally, you need to talk to somebody who understands the migration process, that can help you build that business case, can help you build the processes you'll need to execute on it and get it going. And again, I'll remind you, you have about 14 months. So if you're still on Windows XP and you don't have a plan, the time to make that call is today. So let's talk a little bit about the tools that you can use to do this. I think I mentioned just a minute ago, leading endpoint management solutions. Well, what does that mean? If you look at Forrester Research or the Gartner Magic Quadrants, you'll see the Symantec Altiris Client Management Suite there. You may see Microsoft System Center Configuration Manager there. There may be some other tools that are out there in the world. Most of these tools have facilities for you to gather inventory, to report on that inventory, to maybe collate that into some consumable format, as well as build migration packages and tools and operating system images and deploy those, and then of course ensure compliance and validate those. There are some complementary tools that can help you. And since we're talking about Windows and Office, you can look at the Migration Action Planning Kit. You can look at Microsoft Deployment Toolkit, and you can look at Microsoft's User State Migration Tool. A lot of these are free tools that can be used either standalone or in conjunction with an endpoint management solution to help you assess, build a process, test that process, and then execute it on it in production. So let's talk in a little bit more detail about one of those. Obviously, our alliance and our partnership with Symantec, we have a pretty significant investment in this tool set. We know a lot about how to utilize it to execute on a migration. And what I've outlined here are really the main steps that you want to understand and you want to present in your business case. So first and foremost, we want to leverage the inventory solution in the client management suite to gather information about our deployed state. We want to know which operating systems we have out there. We want to know which architecture they are. We want to know which service pack level they are. We may be concerned with which KVs or bulletins are installed. We want to understand which Office versions are out there, which edition those Office releases are, which architectures they are. In some cases, whether or not they have additional Office applications, right? You're going to need to know if they have, let's say, Office Pro Plus 2010, but they also have maybe Visio and Project installed. We'll need to understand that so that we can make that a part of our migration plan. Once we have all that information, we put it into our CMDB, and we're going to want to use something like IT Analytics solution to assess our readiness level. Now, the great news about this is IT Analytics ships out of the box with some very nice Windows 7 readiness dashboards and reports. If you needed something more specific or customized for your environment, a partner like ITS can provide that. We can come in and build the tools that you need to assess your readiness level. Once we understand that, we're ready to go start building our processes. And once we have our processes, we can build our migration packages. And Software Management Solution provides a good chunk of that functionality. You may be a customer who used to have the Wise Package Studio. You may be on the Flexera replacement tool now. There are also vendor supply tools, Microsoft Setup, Adobe Customization Wizard, different things like that can help you build software release packages so that you can either migrate the applications on a supported operating system, or what we would call a forklift migration, where we would possibly take data off the endpoint, wipe it, put a new operating system on, drop applications back in, and then drop customizations back in. A tool that can help with that, as I've indicated on this slide, is PC Transplant. So if you do have a need to capture user data files in different application settings and support tools, we can do that with a tool like PC Transplant. And then we can utilize Software Management Deployment Solution to execute on that migration. And then finally, if you're feeling like you're optimized, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what does being optimized mean, you can leverage a tool like Symantec Workflow to automate your migration. So if you're in an environment where you would like to have end-user self-service, or you would like to have technicians or architects schedule migrations in batches of machines, Symantec Workflow is a kind of tool that can work with the rest of those solutions in the client management suite to help you automate that and ensure compliance. Now, shifting gear here a little bit, let's talk about what you can do if you're a Microsoft System Center Configuration Manager shop. There's a lot of parallel here we can draw to the Altiris suites, but Configuration Manager includes most of the functionality that you would find in Symantec's Altiris CMS. You would use the configuration manager to gather information about that deployed state, right? What do I have? Where is it? What version? What edition? We can utilize site reporting to assess that readiness level. So again, kind of analogous to IT analytics, we can go in and develop reports and dashboards. We would then use configuration manager and then possibly something like a Flexera tool, which can be integrated. And again, those vendor supplied customization tools like Office Setup or the Adobe Customization Wizard to build our packages and our resources and get those out to the endpoints. And then finally, you know, Configuration Manager, Microsoft Deployment Toolkit. Those are tools that we can use to execute that migration. I do have a note on here about the user state migration tool. That's important, I think, if you are looking at taking user profiles and transitioning those from the endpoint up to the network in what we call a roaming profile scenario. USMT is a very effective tool for that. It's something that can basically forklift that user's profile up to a network share and map it from there. It doesn't do a great job of being selective. It's more of an all or none proposition. If you are looking at doing something that's more selective, or you want to have customizable rules and cherry pick certain items and use a little bit more wildcard functionality, we would point you in the direction of something like PC Transplant from Symantec. But again, USMT can be very effective for relocating those user profiles up to the network. And then finally, we talk a little bit again here about being optimized. If you are at a point in your organization where you've got the IT maturity to automate some of these processes, Orchestrator and Service Manager can be a part of that puzzle. So I've hinted at the last couple slides here about maturity level. And this is something that ITS Partners is a big believer in assessing your maturity model and making sure that we match a tool that fits the organization's maturity level, right? We don't want to give you a tool that's too sophisticated for your environment. We don't want to give you a tool that's not sophisticated enough for your needs. And this is a very simple diagram, but it does a good job of kind of presenting a matrix of where you would fall, right? So if you're in an environment where you're pursuing, cost savings, maybe you're in something like a P2V migration, or you're looking at outsourcing your data center and going to a hosted model, or maybe a public cloud hybrid, something like that, you're pushing towards the optimized level on cost savings. If in your environment you have very rigid SLAs that are finely tuned and well-defined, and the organization is committed to enforcing those, you're probably at the proactive level. If you haven't quite automated some of those functions, let's say a change management request, if that's still sort of a one-touch or a multi-touch process, you might not be at the optimized level for that yet. If you have totally automated change management and release management with self-service for end users, which maps to real resources in your environment, you're probably at the optimized level there. And that really leads you down to automation, is what are you doing in your environment? And this is a much finer line to cross, because we find that most environments haven't really embraced the idea of automation, nor have they done any significant work to actually implement it in their environment. And you need to understand what tools you're using, how those tools integrate with each other, and then what the best automation engine is for your environment. So if you're a Symantec CMS customer, workflow is the solution there. You may not have internally the knowledge or the staffing to create some of your automated processes. So again, you can engage somebody to do that for you and plug it in. But where you fall on this scale is really going to be dictated by what you're doing today, not what you want to do. And so again, if you're sort of in that bottom right quadrant there, where everything is optimized and everything is automated, you're going to be getting significant cost savings. It's not a pursuit, it's something you're getting the benefit of today. So keep the IT maturity level in mind as we talk a little bit about executing on one of these migrations. And you'll see I've titled this slide Strategic Migration. And that's an important concept to understand. Most of the things that we do in enterprise IT are either reactive or tactical, right? We're responding to issues in the environment, we're responding to end user or stakeholder requests, or we're responding to something like a license expiring, right? If your antivirus tool is expiring, In a month, you may engage in a project to migrate to a new version of that tool or a totally different tool. And that's what I mean by tactical migration. You're responding to some sort of situation in the environment. You're not thinking strategically. And executing a well-oiled migration is all about being strategic. And important things that you need to do as you build your business case and you build your processes are identify information and intelligence gaps. And what does that really mean? You don't know what you don't know. You may have heard that in some other context before, but it's as true as it can be in this situation. So you don't know what has not been inventoried. You don't know what is not connected to the network. You don't know what has not been shared with you by either your end users, your customers, your constituents. So those are things that you need to identify where you have gaps in your knowledge. What do you need to do with that information? Well, once we've identified them, we want to remediate or replace systems to close those gaps. A practical example would be maybe we don't understand the network routing to certain remote sites. Well, maybe we need to put in some sort of discovery mechanism, or we need to go to the team responsible for those systems and initiate some kind of knowledge exchange, right? Information exchange, so that we can close that air gap in our information sphere and understand more about what we didn't know before. Because all of these things are going to affect your migration plan. If you don't understand what the bandwidth and the QoS is to remote sites, you're not going to have a successful migration because you won't understand why image replication is failing, or you won't understand why packet replication is not succeeding, or you may not understand why a script is not running. Perhaps it's blocked by a GPO, and you need to go talk to the team that administrates that. So there's a lot of areas that you need to account for. It's not as simple as just dropping a new operating system and Office Suite on and telling the user to go forth and be productive. We need to understand all of the related processes in the enterprise, how those affect our ability to execute on the migration. And important thing to know here is once we've identified all those, we want to facilitate accountability, right? So we have to define who's responsible for certain things, what they need to do to ensure a successful migration, define the actions that they must take, right? And then we need to hold them responsible for that. And the way that we hold people responsible is by documenting and assigning roles and responsibility. There are a lot of acronyms out there for this. You may hear of RACI, or a role and responsibility matrix. That's what I'm talking about here. If there's somebody who is responsible for ensuring that group policies applied in the environment don't interfere with an OS migration, that person's role and contact information and the actions that they are required to take to facilitate that should be clearly defined and documented as part of your business case. And finally, we don't just hit the button and walk away. We want to monitor the progress of our migration. And most important thing to take away from this slide is adjust your approach. Don't go all in on the method you've chosen out of a committee or possibly something you documented on an internal site. We need to understand that the process we go forward with may have to change or be augmented in order to continue to be successful. Because as much as we try to do discovery and understand what we don't know, there will always be things that come up. And this needs to be an understanding all the way through the organization, from the CIO right down to the technician that may be clicking a button or actually moving a computer from place to place. We have to understand that we must be reactive while being strategic, and we must be dynamic in our response and our approach to our daily activity, our monthly activity, and our overall project activity. So a couple of other things that we should talk about today. There are some things that come up and things that we want to share with you that we see in migrations that we execute on every day. Most of you in the audience are probably managing some Macs and iOS devices, right? The enterprise penetration for those devices is very high. Typically, they wind up in the hands of either very important or very noisy users, to put it nicely. So we have to be able to account for these devices and understand how they would be affected by migration and how their presence will affect our business case and our processes. One thing is that Office versions are not the same release on the Mac, right? They are typically on alternate years, although we haven't seen anything since Office 2011 for the Mac. The process doesn't appear to be predictable at all. So if you're looking at deploying the latest Office releases, you're going to be aiming for 2011 on the Mac and 2013 on the PC. Those two releases have almost nothing in common other than the name of the product and some of the applications that are contained in it. There will be gaps on the Mac side. You won't have a Visio replacement. You won't have a project replacement. You will have the ability to share and collaborate on files, but that always doesn't work as well as we would like to see in the real world. There are formatting issues. If you do any advanced work on the Windows side, let's say with Visual Basic macros or pivot tables in Excel, your Mac users aren't going to be able to use that functionality. So not that I'm bashing the Mac Office release here, and it sounds like I am, but I'm not. The idea is that we need to account for this in our migration plan, right? So we want to understand that a Mac user, let's say in the accounting office, if they need to do work with Visual Basic macros, well, they're either going to need a Windows device, or they're going to need a virtualized Windows operating system and Office suite, or they're going to need some form of VDI or application delivery in order to get them the functionality they need to perform their job function. Another thing that we like to point out is you have to look at iOS when you talk about doing migrations. As we'll talk about here in just a minute, typically endpoint application or operating system migrations either precipitate or are precipitated by infrastructure migrations. So if you're going to move to Exchange 2010 in your environment, and as part of that you're going to move to Office 2010, you will want to be aware of how iOS behaves with Exchange 2010, as we see commonly and very recently with the iOS 6.0.1 update. There was a bug introduced with recurring calendar invitations that caused pretty significant negative effects to Exchange servers and their logging capability. So again, just something to be aware of. What we're saying is make sure you account for these devices in your business case and in your process plan. And then finally, when you look at doing a migration, and let's say that's enterprise-wide and you want to include your Mac users in there, there really isn't a commercial personality capture or transplant tool. There's no equivalent for USMT on the Mac OS X side. It can be done with some level of scripting. Typically, you won't have the same level of complexity because of the differences in the operating system architecture. But just be aware that that's either going to be a custom process that you obtain from a partner or a vendor, or something that you develop in-house. So as I indicated on the last slide, typically migrations are either precipitated by infrastructure changes or they precipitate them later, right? So the effect of the migration forces the organization to put in some upgrade. So be aware of these integration points within your enterprise, your Exchange administrators, your project administrators, your SharePoint administrators will want to be involved and should be involved in your business case development for Windows and Office migration. There are a lot of things that they need to be aware of, and there are a lot of things that they can help facilitate to help you make it a successful migration. A specific example is in Office on the Windows side, there is a SharePoint add-in. And what that add-in does is make sure that your Office application can open Office document types from a SharePoint site. If you don't have this add-in, or you have the wrong version of the add-in on your endpoint, your users will get almost infinite authentication prompts every time they open an Office document. This is a pretty poor situation for enterprise IT. It develops a negative perception, and that's just one example of how planning with the right individuals and stakeholders, and making sure that we have all of the infrastructure concerns accounted for, will help make that migration more successful. Something else you'll want to talk about is how are you going to manage external endpoints? Depending on your choice of endpoint management tool and your organizational policy for remote workers, you will have concerns about how am I going to manage those users? How am I even going to get an upgrade in place for them? Can I distribute packages to external users? What about the sales reps that are always on the road and they only connect from a Starbucks? How am I going to get that guy a 2 GB Microsoft Office package so I can get him upgraded? What happens if something breaks before he has to give a presentation to a client? These are the kinds of questions you want to be asking as you start to plan your migration to make sure that you account for these issues. And then finally, understanding the little things. The little things are what will either break your process or make it wildly successful. Printers are a great example of that, right? If you execute a great migration, you get 97% success rate with migrating the operating systems to Windows 7, and you get 100% success with migrating from Office 2007 to 2010. If you forget to reattach your end user's default printer, all they will say is, your upgrade broke my printer and I can't do any work. So it's one of those things we like to point out. I've noted it here as the ultimate time vampire. Depending on what you're doing in your environment with printer management and how those drivers are loaded, that can be a very simple process or very complex, but it's one of the things that people will throw their hands up about if it doesn't go well. And then finally, this kind of leads back to the maturity model. A lot of organizations try to do things at the endpoint. And for many years, this has been fairly effective. And we have, and some customers have tried to migrate to more of a centralized management methodology where we leverage something like Active Directory group policy. My answer is always, why would you do something in 10,000 places if you can do it in one place or maybe 5 places, right? Let's simplify and let's keep that, that point of control as high up the chain or the pyramid as we can. So in the maturity model today, if you're doing things at the endpoint, or you're deploying reg files, or you're deploying, let's say, startup scripts, those kind of things, that's probably on the lower end of the maturity model, right? Because it doesn't lend itself to a lot of automation. It's typically very highly effective, which is why some environments still do it, but it doesn't give us a lot of room to grow and scale. Some environments have kind of gone to a group policy centralized management methodology, as I mentioned, which is great, because that allows you to kind of control the flow of configuration and simplifies the change management. The next stage of that is combining something like group policy settings management with a really sophisticated endpoint management tool like the Symantec management platform in CMS or Microsoft System Center, where we can integrate with group policy, we can deploy group policy, we can complement group policy with centralized management from that endpoint management tool. And once we do that, that gives us sort of the bridge between group policy and automation tools that allows us to really get into that optimized level of the maturity model. So let's talk just a minute here about unsupported systems, because this comes up in every migration and every conversation with every customer. What about my Windows Server 2000 endpoints? My endpoint management tool doesn't support it, or I haven't been getting patches for it, those kind of things. Symantec produces a great product called Critical Systems Protection. They also have SEP, or Symantec Endpoint Protection. These two tools can work independently or in conjunction to help protect those endpoints. If you look at me and say, well, what about my Windows NT endpoints? I'm going to give you the same answer. Deploy CSP and deploy SEP. And then finally, if you talk to me about, well, what about my POS stations or my cashier stations or my bank teller systems or my nurses stations or whatever in your industry or sector might be a desktop class OS that's a critical system, we can help protect that. And CSP and SEP are a great way to do that. When you combine protection or security, endpoint security tools with an endpoint management tool in a very mature settings management methodology, you're going to be at a state where you can then automate and you can be optimized and you can save money and you can save time. So just to kind of recap here, what should you do next after this webcast? Well, one thing is to think tactically. Now, I know I told you to be strategic, but if you're at the point where you're still running Windows XP, the clock is ticking on you, and you don't want to expose yourself to a great amount of risk, start to think tactically. What's the quickest path to protecting your endpoints? What's the quickest path to migrating your endpoints? Those are some questions you should start asking. Let's not forget about being strategic, though, but let's do it going forward. We can't look at the situation today and say, Well, we should have started a business case a year ago, and we'll get going on a strategic migration process, and we'll probably be done in 3 to 4 years. Well, that's great. We want to pursue that, but it's not going to solve the issue of having unprotected or vulnerable systems in 14 months. So again, let's think tactically today. Let's start thinking about what we need to do, what we know, and what we don't know. Let's still work towards being strategic, but let's put in a tactical plan today to get those endpoints migrated or get them protected with another tool. And then finally, you may need expertise or tools to do this. Most IT enterprise shops have very smart people in them that can do a lot of great things. The one thing they can't do is manufacture more time, and that's something that's in scarce availability when you look at products that have had an end-of-life announcement. So a qualified partner is certainly something that can help you manufacture time in a sense that, you know, augment staff or come in and provide some expertise or provide some turnkey processes that enable your internal staff to get going on a migration without having to work 20 hours a day. So that's it for today's kind of talk about migration. Our hope was to kind of give you some important information about what's going on in the market, what products are not going to be supported, what kind of risk that exposes to you, as well as give you a preview of some of the thought process that we put into a migration. If you do need help today, ITS partners can be contacted at the URL listed, or phone number or fax, if that's your preference. So with that, we'll thank you for your time today, and have a great day. Thank you.